Today's reading is from Philippians 1, verses 12 through 21. Now I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that what has happened to me has actually served to advance the gospel. As a result, it has become clear throughout the whole palace guard and to everyone else that I am in chains for Christ. And because of my chains, most of the brothers and sisters have become confident in the Lord and dare all the more to proclaim the gospel without fear. It is true that some preach Christ out of envy and rivalry, but others out of goodwill. The latter do so out of love, knowing that I am put here for the defense of the gospel. The former preach Christ out of selfish ambition, not sincerely, supposing that they can stir up trouble for me while I am in chains. But what does it matter? The important thing is that in every way, whether from false motives or true, Christ is preached. And because of this, I rejoice. Yes, and I will continue to rejoice. For I know that through your prayers and God's provision of the Spirit of Jesus Christ, what has happened to me will turn out for my deliverance. I eagerly expect and hope that I will in no way be ashamed, but will have sufficient courage so that now, as always, Christ will be exalted in my body, whether by life or by death. For to me, to live is Christ, and to die is gain. This is the word of the Lord. You may be seated.
You know, the interesting thing about two services is that most of the times, if you want to know what I'm thinking at the beginning of second service, was whether I hated first service and I'm going to try to change anything, or I loved first service and I want to try to make what I did in first service. And right now what I'm thinking about is just how much I wish you knew Jesus wanted to use you. I believe in church. I'm a pastor. Kind of be a foolish thing for me to not believe in church. But if you ask me what's deep inside of my heart, it's not this. It's not how good Sunday mornings can be. It's not how big Sunday mornings can be. It's the fact that you are a son or a daughter of Jesus and your life has been marked for incredible things. And I don't think you believe him. I don't think you understand the weight and the gravity that your own life holds. You know, this last few weeks, I've been thinking about the story in the scriptures about the rich young ruler that has this moment with Jesus where Jesus does something with him he didn't do to anyone else outside of the 12, to give an open door to be one of his disciples in his inner circle. And here in this conversation back and forth with what the scriptures call this rich young ruler, Jesus asks him for the one thing he's not willing to give, the wealth of his house. And it says that the young man turns away so sad because he wasn't ultimately willing to give up the one thing that Jesus has asked him for. There's a lot of possible interpretations about that scripture. I think many of them true. The sad thing is what I find is that when most of us read that story, somehow we put ourselves in the shoes of either Jesus or the disciples, when probably the only faithful interpretation of that scripture is to find ourselves in the shoes of the rich young ruler. I wonder how many of us, there's a depth, there's a longing in the heart of God to do something that we couldn't even think possible with our lives. But we're holding on to what's safe. We're holding on to what we know. We're holding on to what makes us comfortable. And Jesus is leaning in saying, if you would just trust me, you could not imagine the life I have for you. And how many of us are held back from the fullness of Jesus because we love what keeps us safe. If I could convince any of you of one thing, it would be that Jesus is better than being safe. That Jesus is more beautiful than all of the wealth in your house. That Jesus is worth whatever the cost may be. And whatever is the substance of our personal rich young ruler nature. May we be a people who would say anything for you, Jesus. Whatever you ask, Jesus. You're so good. You're so true. You're so faithful. You're so perfect. You have more inside of you. You have more of a calling on your life. You have more substance with Jesus than I know how to articulate to you. And as your pastor, my deepest dream for your life is that you would wake up to the fullness of God for you. Because when that happens in you, it'll change everybody around you. And you want to know what the church doesn't need, or what Atlanta doesn't need, is another great Sunday morning service. It just doesn't. Come on, all of us in this room have probably been to Passion. It does not need another great Sunday morning service. It's got plenty of them. You want to know what our city needs? Followers of Jesus that are actually willing to look like Jesus Monday through Saturday, no matter the circumstances. There's got to be something that rises up in our hearts. If I were to be a betting man, which I'm not, because I'm poor, and that would be a problem, I would bet this. Most of us in the room feel some sense of jadedness towards Christianity in the church. And I say that not because I'm trying to be like noble or prophetic. I'm just around you enough, and I'm around people like you enough. And I said this last week, it doesn't matter when I go and I speak at missions conferences, when I go and speak to church planners, it doesn't matter who I'm around. When I'm around Christians under the age of 50, they're jaded. And they're jaded because all of us recognize there is a hope in Jesus that is bigger and truer and deeper than what religion and a Sunday morning service can touch. And that doesn't mean I don't believe in this. Of course I do. Profound things happen when we gather together and we worship the King who made us. Profound things happen together when the gospel is preached. Profound things happen when we pray together. I'm just saying the hope of the world does not rest in how you and I gather right here, right now. The hope of the world rests in what you and I choose to do with it. That our neighborhood desperately needs Christians who are genuinely, truly, deeply Christian, who in their life and in their action, in their substance, love like Jesus. Who when they hear Jesus say it's time to pick up your cross, they say, yes, Father. When they hear Jesus say it's time to get your bowl and your towel and wash the feet of your neighborhood and your enemies, we say, yes, Jesus. Because there's something truer in this world that you and I have the ability to find and live a part of and take advantage of. And we all feel it, we all see it like this hopeful transcendence in the atmosphere that if we could just touch it, we could just find it, we could just live it, it would change everything about us. The thing you've got to know is it's there. All you've got to do is step into it. I've often thought that the greatest analogy for the true Christian life is what C.S. Lewis captures in Narnia. Friends, there is another world in intimacy with Jesus. There is another world in following him. Being a Christian isn't figuring out how you get a boring version of an American life. Being a Christian is opening a door into a whole nother world where a king named Jesus has a kingdom that you can be a part of and that you can learn how to live as an exile in a broken world for the name of Jesus. There is something truer in Jesus than we could have ever thought possible. I will spend the rest of my life trying to convince you of that. Trying to convince you that Jesus is just simply worthy of all of your heart and all of your life. You know, when I was a kid, it was interesting that I hated junior high. Anyone else? Anyone with me that junior high is the 3 worst years in the life of all human beings? And if you meet somebody that had a good junior high, that means they were the bully and you shouldn't be friends with them, right? Junior high was like the 3 hardest, most evil years in my life. And part of it was that actually growing up, I was very shy and I was really easily embarrassed. And it was this weird thing I kind of went through. It wasn't until college that I found any kind of sense of confidence. And so junior high was this really weird place for me because I was shy. All of my close friends went to church with me. None of them went to school with me, so I was very lonely. I actually remember like in junior high walking around the campus at lunch because I didn't have anyone to sit with. And remember back in the early 90s, the hacky sack, you know what I'm talking about? I would just like, this is one of those like sad pictures where I was just in the corner of my junior high just playing hacky back by myself, right? This was junior high for me. Yes, laugh at my pain. No, I'm joking. But it was weird. So I was not popular. I did not have friends. I did not hang out with one. I hated junior high. But at the same time, I also had this weird thing happening in my life. I deeply wanted to be class president, right? And it was this very dualistic desire in my life. And often I've looked back and I'm like, why in the world did every year in elementary school, junior high, and high school did I attempt for run for class president? I still remember my 7th grade speech running for class president. It was the top 10 reasons why Ace Ventura would vote for me, right? You got to remember this is the early 90s. And I'm pretty sure number 7 was because I would fit like a glove, right? And this was my world. And here was this weird thing. I remember 8th grade, 9th grade. Like this was this desire in my heart somewhere in the midst of hating junior high, not being popular, being a loner. I still had something inside of me that goes, you should lead, right? I remember in junior high, like I grew up in Idaho, so we would go to these winter youth camps in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, and sometimes the snow would be so high, the snow would literally be like 8 or 9 feet high, and they would have to dig tunnels all the way through them. It was magical, and my favorite thing was standing on the top of the snowbanks and just throwing snowballs at people as they're walking by. And I went to junior high winter camp for one reason alone, to flirt with girls. That was it, right? I was a profoundly spiritual Christ follower in those moments of my life. And yet, isn't it interesting? Here I was at junior high camp, and this was the only real reason I wanted to go. And I still remember this night when I was 13, this bonfire, this night of acoustic worship, and in the midst of all of my mixed desires and false desires and, adolescent mess, I remember at this bonfire just falling in love with Jesus. And something inside my heart just saying, God, I want to give you all of my life. All of my life. And it's interesting as you grow in age and you find yourself more and more in things that didn't make sense at the time. You can look back now, and what I couldn't have articulated in 7th and 8th and 9th and in 10th grade in the middle of my teenage angst and loneliness, and was that something deep in my life was saying, you have a calling. You're a leader. You have a calling. And how beautiful it is that even without me knowing the fullness of the story, God was planting these seeds in my own life to be a leader. The truth is, friends, as much as that's true for me, it's true for you as well. And it's true for us. We as a church have a calling. There's a reason why God uses the body of Christ. We're not all supposed to look the same. We're not all supposed to act the same. We're not all supposed to have the same mission. We're all supposed to be on team together for the sake of Jesus. But there is something profound and unique about every single believer. See, this is my great problem, that we have perverted the church and making it an event instead of it being family. Because when we make church an event, we make it something that we attend and can separate ourselves from, then ultimately what we can say is, I don't have to belong to that sense of calling. But when we reclaim church as family, you know this as much as I do. When you say yes to family, you say yes to partnering with the calling that's on your family's life. And there is something it's bigger than me. It's bigger than the few of us in this church. It's about all of us. There is something that God has asked us to do that is different than what he's asked other people to do. And there is a calling there. That when you and I would find it, when we would see it, when we would say yes to it, when we would take part in it, the truth is that you would come alive in a way that you never have before. I am convinced of this. You were created to belong to church family, to thrive in church family, and to find unity in church family, to find calling in church family. And a great reason why so many people in a millennial generation are struggling with hope and struggling with the sense, because they are living radically individual lives, disconnected from the people around them. And the purpose of your calling cannot be found on your own. The calling of the church is the churches. It's not the individuals. There's something that we have to come back to To say we belong to something beautiful together. And friends, don't hear me. Don't hear me be coercive or manipulative. You've got to find that somewhere. If it's not here, then find it somewhere. You were made to belong to a community of people that would give themselves for a greater cause. You should find that community. You should struggle with that community. You should get offended and reconcile with that community. You should learn how to have love, grace, and forgiveness among that community. You should lay down your rights for their rights in that community. You should find the other that you don't understand and don't always fully see and celebrate them and know that there should be something better than all of this. We have a calling. And I think that calling in many ways is captured by this moment of Paul and this church in Philippi in Philippians 1. I love what he says. Now I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that what has happened to me has actually served to advance the gospel. Paul's in prison. Isn't it interesting they call Philippians the epistle of joy? Paul is chained to a Roman jail cell. And it's the epistle of joy. If you and I wrote this letter, you want to know how it would begin? God, I thought you were good. God, I thought you said you were my father. I don't understand why these things are happening in my life. I don't know if I really trust your character anymore, God. That's what happened if we wrote these letters in the 21st century. Thank God that Paul is not us. Now, I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that what has happened to me has actually served to advance the gospel. As a result, it has become clear throughout the whole palace guard and everyone else that I am in chains for Christ. And because of my chains, most of the brothers and sisters have become confident in the Lord and dare all the more to proclaim the gospel without fear. Here's what Paul's thinking about in jail for preaching the gospel. I'm so happy that the people around me are encouraged and that the people in the jails are beginning to learn about Jesus. What would happen if you and I actually viewed our suffering and our sacrifice in the same lens? I mean, I'm walking through this really hard thing, but you know what's awesome? Everybody around me is getting to hear the gospel because of it. Imagine what would happen if you and I stepped into Paul's shoes in his heart and longed to walk with him in this way. And then he says, it is true that some preach Christ out of envy and rivalry, but others out of goodwill. Let me tell you what's actually happening here. That there is these actually community of false preachers that don't believe in Jesus, that are actually going around to all of the areas in which Paul has preached, and they are trying to proclaim the gospel to intentionally start riots, that the Roman government will simply decide that Paul is too much of a rabble-rouser, and they'll behead him, right? So let's be clear what's happening. False teachers who don't believe in Jesus are proclaiming Jesus, so Paul gets murdered, okay? And Paul says, but what does it matter? The important thing is that in every way, whether from false motives or true, Jesus is preached. Could you imagine? Could you imagine somebody going around your workplace and they are preaching the gospel in your workplace because they're hopeful that your workplace will murder you because they're doing that? And what you would think and feel, you would probably be like, this is crazy. You need to stop doing this. And Paul's like, I kind of like it. I'm just telling you, I'm just grateful more people hear about Jesus. And you're like, who are you? Who is this person that's writing this letter? And because of this, I rejoice. Yes, and I will continue to rejoice. For I know that through your prayers and God's provision of the Spirit of Jesus Christ, what has happened to me will turn out for my deliverance. He's like, friends, I am content. I just trust Jesus with this. I eagerly and expect that I hope and will no way be ashamed, but will have sufficient courage so that now, as always, Christ will be exalted in my body, whether by life or by death. And then this simple yet powerful line. For me, to live is Christ, and to die is gain. To live is Christ, and to die is gain. It's almost like you just hear Paul's heart and words in this moment. Saying, the thing you have to understand about my life is this. To live is Jesus, and to die is just more Jesus. So I'm really not concerned about whether I live or die. I have a single focus. That there is something in Jesus that is better and truer and more worthy of all of me than anything else. Friends, We have a really, really simple vision. It's that we just think Jesus is better. We think Jesus is better than comfort. We think Jesus is better than the American dream. We think Jesus is better than the circumstances we face. We think Jesus is better than whatever could happen or come our way. We just think that Jesus is better. And we want to be a church family that would echo with Paul. For me to live is Jesus, and to die is just more Jesus. This is the calling that's on our life. And there's this simple phrase that has come into my heart over this last month. It's not profound, but it captures what I feel like Jesus is asking of us. That I think the word and the heartbeat of Paul would just echo this. Whatever it takes. Whatever it takes for us to say yes to Jesus, whatever it takes for us to see God move, whatever it takes for us to be obedient, that is what we are going to do. Because here in Paul's heart, I hear him saying, you want to know what my life is about? My life is about people knowing Jesus. And you want to know what I'm going to do to help make that happen? Whatever it takes. And whether that's me thriving with this incredible ministry that has size and brilliance and people adore it, or it is me sitting in a jail cell chained to a Roman guard. It doesn't matter to me, whatever it takes. Whatever it takes. And for us as a church, we have this deep sense of calling to what God has asked us to do. And our simple response is whatever it takes. Whatever it takes. Let me share with you 3 glimpses, things that God stirred in our hearts from the beginning. If you've been with us for a while, you maybe have heard me say a few of these things, but if you're new within the last year, potentially you've never heard some of these things before. If you don't know our story, Emily and I moved here 4.5 years ago with our 2 children at the time. We have 4 kiddos now, with just 2 friends, believing that we could actually start a movement of Christ followers that would change the city of Atlanta. God began to do this profound work in our lives. What started in a Bible study in our living room of 6 turned into this thing where we started doing worship services in our garage because we just wanted to seek Jesus. And suddenly we outgrew our garage. I remember when people asked me in those days, hey, how's your church plant going? And I'd say, well, good news, we're outgrowing our first building. I would just fail to mention that building was a two-car garage in our basement. But God was doing this work in our church, and we realized that now was the time to begin to take some steps. So we found this old building, or rather the miraculous story that this old building found us, was given to us in a mess, in a total disarray, but we knew there were promises on it. And so we came together, and Sunday nights we just began to worship and seek God and believe Him that God could actually show up in our day like He did in the book of Acts. That you didn't have to send 1 billion flyers and be an event model church to actually reach people for the cause of Jesus. You could actually just love people like Jesus, and it would change lives. So we started living in our sense of self, and it was good and it was hard, and there were days it felt like we were winning and days we felt like we were failing, but God was doing something in our midst. And we realized this turning point came Easter 2015. We launched our first Sunday morning service, had this heartbeat to do church as family. We launched missional communities all around our city, and God has been faithfully moving us forward from there. But in those moments, there's things that He spoke to us, things we will never lose, things we will never shake. Here they are. I remember in the beginning when we were still in Seattle and Emily and I were praying with a handful of people, there was this phrase that kept coming up. God was asking us to put flesh and blood to the resurrection. He was asking us to embody the reality of what Jesus had done in our city. You know what was interesting? When we first knew that we were moving to Atlanta to plant a church, you want to know what my response was? Please, God, not Atlanta. Right? It actually didn't have anything to do with Atlanta. And by the way, like, I'm in love with Atlanta. Atlanta's my home. Like, we're here. I can't wait for my kids to graduate from Campbell High School one day. This is our home. We're here, right? But I remember saying, Jesus, I am willing to go anywhere. I'm willing to lay down anything for you. I'm willing to go back on the mission field. And you want to send me to Atlanta? Atlanta doesn't need another church. God, send me somewhere that needs a church. Send us somewhere that needs a church. And I had this deep wrestling because all that was driving my heart was I wanted to bring the gospel to people that had never heard it before. And I thought, Atlanta, why Atlanta? I remember sitting in my living room wrestling with this question going, God, why are you sending us to Atlanta? And I heard the Holy Spirit speak back to me saying, I'm not sending you because they need another church, Phil. I'm sending you because they need me. There is a profound difference between believing in what Jesus can do and trying to give your allegiance to an organization. I believe in the local church. I'll never stop believing in the local church. But what Atlanta doesn't need is another slick local church. What Atlanta desperately needs are Christ followers who are willing to embody the resurrection. That the way you treat your family looks like Jesus. The way you treat your neighborhood looks like Jesus. The way you treat your workplace looks like Jesus. The way you handle suffering looks like Jesus. The way you use your money looks like Jesus, because we have a task that's in front of us. And it's worthy of our hearts and our lives. We say it this way: we have a calling just to reclaim the way of Jesus in our day. We want to be sincere, authentic Christ followers. Last night we had this event for those that are helping lead some efforts we want to do on sex slavery issues, on anti-human trafficking issues. And we had a woman here who shared her own story about being trafficked. It was one of the most gut-wrenching things to hear in my life. And we had a man named Leroy who leads this organization called Serenity Steps that basically works with women currently finding themselves, whether by force or by choice, in the sex industry, and serves them. And he was talking about how he's been welcoming them into their home. He and his wife have been loving them and trying to see them reconciled back to God, healthy, thriving. And how there's these escorts that they've built relationship from all around the Southeast, that these women learn how to love and trust this family because they're walking with them. And there were some of these escorts in Florida that didn't have anywhere to go because of the storms. And so they reached out to him and he said, "You can come and stay at my house." He and his wife said, "You can come and stay at my house." These women, and so they drive up, and there's these handful of women. There was one specifically that over years they've been trying to share the gospel with, but her heart is so hard because of her experiences with Christians and circumstances that she doesn't want to receive the gospel. But in this radical act of love, you can imagine this couple that are pastors in their house with several different sex escorts in their living room, and they're sitting there, and one of them looks at Leroy and just says, "Are you Jesus?" And Leroy just laughs, and he looks back and he goes, "No, but I do work for him." And I love that picture. Because, friends, that should be the substance of all of our lives. Right. Yeah. I'm not saying we all have the same calling or we all have to do it the same way. But you and I should be living in such a way that people get around us and they go, "Who are you? Who loves like this? Who gives like this? Who suffers like this? Who believes like this? Are you Jesus?" No. But we do work for him. This is our heart, friends. We have to reclaim the way of Jesus. I also remember walking around these streets, walking on Bank Street right here. And not Bankhead, Bank Street. Two very different streets. And wrestling with God. It was in the first few months of being here. And I remember telling God, I don't know how to plant a church. You sent me here to fail. I can't do this. I'm not capable of doing this. You're asking me to do something that's so hard. I can't do this. I remember telling God, this is the percentage of church plants that fail. And specifically, these are the percentage of their church plants that fail that try to do it like how I'm doing it. Why did you send me here to fail, Jesus? It feels like you're sending me here to fail. And I remember wrestling with that, walking on this street and hearing this conversation telling Jesus, you've asked me to do something I can't do. And then having this moment of encounter with the Holy Spirit where I heard the voice of God speak back to me and say, "Phil, I didn't send you here to plant one church. I sent you here to plant a church in every greater neighborhood of Atlanta." And it was the craziest moment. I didn't have enough faith to believe God for this. I didn't. But the moment God asked me to do something that I actually wasn't capable of doing, this thing clicked inside of me and I thought, "Okay, Jesus, let's do this." And over those next weeks, we took this map and I began to map out, if God's really asking us to plant a church in every greater neighborhood of Atlanta, how many churches does that mean? And for us, we've identified 67 greater neighborhoods in metro Atlanta that we want to have a presence in. You want to know the dreams of what we've been called to do? It's to give ourselves for the revival of our city. And we won't believe for anything less. In a while ago, we had this first vision night, and I shared these few pictures, right? This is our church right now, but this isn't our dream. Our dream isn't that this one church becomes as big as it possibly can be. Our dream is actually that God does something so profound here that this becomes this, and this becomes this, right? And I didn't do one with 67 on it. I realize I should have now, but you get the idea. that we believe that God has actually put a calling on our church's life to take churches all over the city, to bring the gospel all over the city. We have a calling to contend for the revival of Atlanta, friends. Listen, you may agree with me, you may disagree with me, but I'm going to tell you the conviction of my heart. America is a spiritual wasteland, and vast majority of people thought they have heard Christianity and rejected it. I will give the rest of my life to contend with God for a spiritual awakening in our generation, because it's the only hope we've got. That God would move in such a radical way that would return hearts of fathers back to their sons and hearts of sons back to their fathers, and that there would be a radical restoration of what's possible in Jesus. I believe him. I believe him. I think God is going to do an incredible thing in and through our lives. And the last picture was still when Emily and I were in Seattle, that we knew we were going, but I was wrestling with fear. I was so afraid of failure. Have you guys ever been in moments where the thing that you either feel like you have to do or God is asking you to do is just so big, but you're so afraid you're going to fail? At least that was true for me. And I remember it was in this season where God was really speaking to me through the story found in Luke 15. Luke 15 is 3 stories that you've probably heard before. It's a story about a lost son, a lost sheep, and a lost coin. Most of us would know that as the story of the prodigal son. But Jesus is standing amongst a community of Pharisees, sitting and eating lunch and a meal with tax collectors and sinners, surrounded by Pharisees, and they're concerned by his activity with sinners. And so they're asking why he would do such a thing. And Jesus, in response to the Pharisees, begins to tell them these 3 stories. And he tells them about a shepherd who loses a sheep. So he goes and he finds the shepherd and he brings him back, right? And then he celebrates because the sheep that once was lost has now been found. And then Jesus tells a second story about a woman who loses a coin, and she searches her entire house until she finally finds this coin. And then once she finds it, she throws this massive party because she celebrates that this coin that was once lost has now been found. And then Jesus tells this profound story about a lost son and a father and an older son, this incredible story about redemption, yet there was one thing missing in the story that was disconnected from the other 2. Was that in the third story of a lost son, nobody went searching for what was lost. You see, and in the culture in the day of Jesus, they would have saw this. Because if the story had actually been true, and most likely in some circumstances, people had heard of stories that had probably been like this. You see, it was the role of the older brother to go after the younger brother. And as Jesus is telling this story, what he's actually doing is he's looking at a community of Pharisees saying, you were the older brother, and you didn't go. You had one job, to go after the younger brothers, to go after the younger sons that ran away and found themselves in mess. This is the calling that's on your life. And what Jesus is actually saying through the story of the prodigal son is, I am the true older brother. I am the one who came after them. I am the one who will come and reconcile them. I am the one who will come and win them back. And the whole heartbeat is about older brothers being challenged by the person of Jesus, as Jesus would look at us and say, will you come with me? Will you come with me? So here I am sitting in my chapel reflecting on this truth as it's affecting my life, and I have an encounter with the Holy Spirit. I see this picture open up in front of my eyes, and it's this picture of a really long table, like this family table that's really long, and there are tons and tons of people all around this table. But I can't see them, they're shadowy. And as I look at this table, I hear Jesus speak to my heart, Phil, you have younger brothers and sisters you have to go find. You've got to go find them. I'm sending you to Atlanta because you have younger brothers and sisters you have to go find. And I remember it was this day I came home and I told Emily, it doesn't matter what happens. It doesn't matter how hard it hurts. It doesn't matter in several years if we limp back to Seattle as failures. We have to say yes. Because we have a calling. Calling to bring back the lost sons and daughters of Atlanta. Friend, that's why we're here. Because Jesus is desperately in love with the world. And he's asking his church to be the older brother who goes. To be the older brother who says yes. to the older brother who celebrates with the heart of the Father that would give their life away for the lost sons and daughters of the world. This is our heart. Linz, if you want to come up, we're going to close. Friends, we are not short on vision. We want to be a viral church planting church. We want to plant a church in every greater neighborhood of Atlanta. I could spend a whole nother morning telling you about all the deep dreams in our heart. We believe that God has asked us to start a missions base, that we believe that here in the next few years, we're actually going to pioneer a YWAM base in the midst of what we're doing. We believe that God has asked us to start a school, that we're going to be able to raise young followers of Jesus, that has a heartbeat not to only see them know God, but actually to have a depth of faith that we need to see our children have in this day in our life. We dream of having a kids ministry that is just the most remarkable thing. We have all of these dreams in our heart. The vision of our house is nothing short than a takeover of the city of Atlanta. But it's all meaningless unless we get the one thing right. Which is that all we want to do is say yes to him. All we want to do is say yes to Jesus. What will the mark of our life be? What will the mark of your life be? It's a question you need to wrestle with. Friends, it is so easy to be lulled to sleep by a culture of comfort, to buy into the lie that the American dream and the Christian dream are the same dream, to realize that the suffering and the injustices around us in our city are not your problem. And then I hear Jesus standing on the door knocking, saying, I'm the older brother who's going to crash into racial issues, who's going to crash into human trafficking issues, who's going to go for the lost. And he's looking at his church saying, will someone come with me? Will someone come with me? Will someone have my heart for the city? That's what he's asked us to do. So you want to know the vision of our church? It's really simple. Yes, Jesus. Whatever you ask, yes, Jesus. I don't care what it costs. I don't care what it means. I don't care what people think about me. I don't care what opinions that people have. My response is one thing. Yes, Jesus, because you're worthy. Yes, Jesus, because you're better. Yes, Jesus, because you're a good Father. Yes, Jesus, because you love us. Yes, Jesus, because your intentions are good. So all of my life, may it be yours. For me to live is Christ, and to die is gain. This becomes the rallying cry of our church. And the season we're going into is one where we would simply together say, whatever it takes. Whatever it takes for foster care to end in our lifetime, whatever it takes. Whatever it takes to answer the problems of modern day orphans, whatever it takes. Whatever it takes to reclaim the radical generosity of the Christian movement, whatever it takes. We're taking the filter off, we're taking the walls off, we're taking the roof off, and we're just saying yes to Jesus. This is the family that I want to belong to. Full of grace and mercy as we screw up time and time again, trying to say yes to the one true King named Jesus. Let me end on this story, and then we're going to just close in a song of worship. I don't know if you guys remember, I'm sure you do, the movie Schindler's List. It's one of those movies that's so painful and yet so important, telling the story of the Holocaust and so much of the things that happened to the Jewish people. Schindler, and I remember the end of that movie, and the end of that movie haunts me. I don't know if you remember this with me. The movie's in black and white, and Schindler is standing with all of the Jewish people that he had rescued. And they came to say thank you to him. It's this very moving moment. And then suddenly, as he's around these people, he looks and he sees his car. And he looks and he sees his suit. And he looks and he sees these pins. And suddenly, all he can see is how many more people he could have bought with them. And he begins to break down. And he looks at the car and he says, why didn't I sell this? If I could have sold this, I could have saved this many more people. And why do I still have this thing? If I would have sold this, this was 3 people right here. And he begins to weep with the realization, I could have done more. I could have done more for the sake of people. And I wonder, at one point, in one day, whenever you and I see Jesus face to face, how many of us will suddenly have this deep, deep grief inside of us because we lived for the wrong things. We lived for things that can't translate to eternity. We lived for things that don't matter in the life to come. And at some point, there's going to be a grief inside of us that says, I could have given more. I could have laid down more. Why did I say yes to this instead of this? Listen, I want to live my life in one way. That it doesn't matter how broken and crippled I get to the feet of Jesus. I want a train of people behind me. That is a life worth living. That is a life that's worthy of the gospel. That's the life Jesus has called us to have. Of radical love for other. Friends, we don't have a poverty mentality here. I think God wants to bless you and bless you and bless you and bless you. I think he wants to make you prosper. I think he wants to give you influence. I think he just wants to teach you how to use all of those things for his kingdom and not for yourself. Because joy can only be found in intimacy with him. And joy is just better than happiness. 100 billion times out of 100 billion times. May we be a community of people who say no to the cheapness of momentary happiness and say yes to the depths of eternal joy. Because he's worth it. I'm not a perfect man, far from it. I'm going to fail you. You are going to fail people. Welcome to the human existence. This is why we have a God of grace who loves you, who's for you, who wants to wrap his arms around you and wants to send you to change the world. This is why I exist. This is why you exist. This is why we exist. Come on, will you stand with me? We're just going to close in this final song, which just captures our heart and it captures the heart of God. My request for you as we sing this together to close our time, would you be willing, if you need to come to Jesus and say, I need to re-give you my heart. I need to come back to a place that says whatever it takes, that you would do this with him. Come on, let's just worship through this final song and I'll close our service.